Family helps family. That was the first thing Mark said when he called me out of the blue one afternoon, his voice dripping with the same old expectation I had heard my entire life. He didn't ask, he assumed. He didn't consider, he demanded. He wanted to bring his wife and kids to my vacation home for the summer, stay there without paying a dime, treat it like his own personal getaway while I, the actual owner, was supposed to just nod along and be fine with it. I had one word for him, short and absolute.
No.
The silence stretched on the other end of the line, thick with disbelief, and then came the sharp exhale, the kind that always preceded one of Mark's entitled rants. "You're kidding me, right?" he finally said, his tone a perfect blend of outrage and smugness, as if he was certain I would backpedal the moment he pushed hard enough. "You're seriously telling me no? To your own brother?" I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the city skyline through my office window, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Mark," I replied evenly, already exhausted by the conversation before it had even begun. "I don't rent out my vacation home, and I'm not about to let you move in for free. It's not happening." Mark scoffed loudly, the sound crackling through the phone, followed by an incredulous laugh that I recognized all too well. It was the same laugh he had used every time he got caught red-handed as a kid but refused to admit he was in the wrong.
Wow.
"Just wow," he muttered, and I could practically hear him shaking his head. "Unbelievable. You've got this huge place just sitting there empty, and you won't even let your own family use it? What the hell is wrong with you?" Here we go. The guilt trip, the moral high ground, the complete and utter disregard for the fact that this was my property, my investment, something I had worked my ass off to afford. Mark had always been like this, always looking for a shortcut, always expecting others to pick up the slack while he coasted by, convinced the world owed him something. "Nothing's wrong with me, Mark," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What's wrong is you thinking you're entitled to something just because it exists. I worked hard for that house, I maintain it, I pay for it. You don't just get to claim it because you want a free vacation." The line was silent for a moment, but I knew it wasn't over.
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Mark was never the type to take no for an answer, not when he had a whole arsenal of manipulation tactics at his disposal. Sure enough, he sighed heavily, the sound exaggerated for effect, before switching gears. "Look, man, I get it. You're all about money now, you've got your whole successful lifestyle going, and maybe you've forgotten what it's like to actually help people. But this isn't just some random request. We're family, and family helps family." That phrase, that tired, overused, self-serving phrase that Mark always pulled out whenever he wanted something he hadn't earned. I had heard it 1,000 times before, but it had never carried any weight because, in reality, Mark's version of help was always one-sided. It meant I helped him. It meant I made sacrifices while he reaped the benefits. It meant I gave while he took, never once considering how unfair the dynamic was. I sighed, rubbing my temple as frustration bubbled beneath my skin. "Mark, helping family doesn't mean letting them take advantage of you. It means mutual support, not one person doing all the giving while the other just takes. You have a job, don't you? You and Amanda both work. You can afford to rent a place like normal people." Mark let out another humorless laugh, but this one had an edge to it. "So that's it, huh? You're just gonna shut the door on your own brother and let your fancy house sit there empty while we struggle to find a decent place for the summer?" "You're not struggling," I shot back, tired of the theatrics. "You just don't want to spend the money. That's not my problem." The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, charged with something unspoken. I knew Mark well enough to recognize when he was recalculating, figuring out his next move, deciding how to play his hand. And then, just when I thought he might give up and accept reality, he sighed again, long, drawn out, filled with disappointment. "You've changed, man," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost mournful. "You used to care about more than just money. You used to actually be there for people. I don't even know who you are anymore." I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay calm. "I haven't changed, Mark. I just stopped letting people walk all over me." A sharp inhale, Another beat of silence, and then the line went dead. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone, the weight of the conversation still lingering in the air. I knew my brother well enough to understand that this wasn't the end of it. He wasn't the type to take no gracefully, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let this go without trying something else. He would find another way. And something in the way he had gone quiet before hanging up made my stomach churn with unease. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It had been 2 weeks since my last conversation with Mark, and in that time, I had convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, he had taken my refusal seriously. I hadn't heard from him, hadn't received any passive-aggressive texts, hadn't gotten any guilt-tripping calls from our mother urging me to reconsider. It was almost too quiet, but I chose to believe that, for once, he had accepted that the answer was no and moved on like an adult. That illusion shattered the moment my phone rang late one evening, the name on the screen belonging to my neighbor who lived a few houses down from my vacation home. "Hey, I thought you rented the place out or something," he said the moment I answered, his voice casual but laced with curiosity. "Just saw a family moving around in there, lights on, cars in the driveway, the whole deal." My grip on the phone tightened, my heartbeat instantly picking up as a cold wave of realization crashed over me. I sat up straight, already reaching for my laptop with my free hand, my fingers clenching as I tried to keep my voice level. "What do you mean, a family? Did you get a good look at them?" Well, I didn't want to be a creep about it. My neighbor chuckled, clearly oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "But yeah, a couple of adults, 2 kids, looked pretty comfortable. Figured maybe it was some relatives of yours?" I didn't answer, my mind already racing through the possibilities as I yanked open my laptop and pulled up my security system. The cameras took only a few seconds to load, but the sight that filled my screen made my blood run hot with rage. There they were, Mark, his wife Amanda, their 2 kids, lounging in my goddamn house like they owned the place. The kitchen lights were on, Amanda was pouring herself a glass of wine, Mark was sprawled out on the couch watching television, and the kids were running up and down the hallway like it was their personal playground. They had moved in. Without asking. Without permission. Without so much as a damn courtesy text. I didn't even realize I was gripping my phone so hard until my neighbor's voice cut through my thoughts. You good?" I forced myself to exhale slowly through my nose, my jaw tightening as I kept my eyes locked on the screen. "Yeah," I muttered, barely recognizing my own voice through the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I'll handle it. Thanks for letting me know." The moment I hung up, I dialed Mark's number, my hands practically shaking with fury as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times before he finally picked up. "Hey, bro," he answered, sounding infuriatingly casual, as if this was just a friendly check-in and not the moment I was about to rip him a new one. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" I asked, my voice low and dangerously calm, a stark contrast to the fire burning inside my chest. Mark sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested I was the one being difficult. "Relax, man. We already moved in. Figured it wasn't a big deal since you weren't using it." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, a slow, steady drumbeat of disbelief and fury. "You already moved in?" I repeated, my fingers curling into a tight fist. "You just what? Broke in and made yourself at home?" "Broken?" Mark scoffed, letting out a short laugh like I had just said something ridiculous. "Come on, don't be dramatic. The spare key was right where you always keep it, so technically I didn't break in. I just let us in. And besides, we needed a place to stay and you weren't using it, so what's the big deal?" The sheer audacity of his words left me momentarily speechless. He didn't even sound apologetic. If anything, he sounded annoyed, like I was inconveniencing him by calling him out on his blatant trespassing. "The big deal, Mark," I said slowly, gripping the edge of my desk to keep from slamming my fist down in frustration, "is that this is my house, not yours. I told you no. You don't just get to ignore that and do whatever the hell you want." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by another exasperated sigh. "Look, man, I get that you're all about your property and your money and whatever, but can you just chill? We're family. It's not like we're strangers off the street. We'll take care of the place. We'll clean up after ourselves, and hey, we'll even stock the fridge before we leave. You won't even know we were here." I almost laughed at the sheer absurdity of his words. "You're strangers off the street, Mark. As far as I'm concerned, you're trespassing, and if you don't get the hell out of my house by tomorrow morning, I'm calling the police." That got his attention. The fake calm vanished from his voice, replaced by immediate indignation. "Whoa, whoa, whoa. You'd seriously call the cops on me? Your own brother? Are you actually hearing yourself right now?" I stood up, pacing the length of my office, trying to keep my composure. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mark. You broke into my house. You moved in without permission. And now you're trying to act like I'm the one being unreasonable." He let out a bitter laugh. "Jesus, you're really that heartless, huh? I told Amanda you'd pull some selfish crap like this. Can't believe I ever thought you'd help your own family." I took a slow breath, forcing myself to push past the anger and focus on what mattered. Mark wasn't going to listen to reason. He had already decided that he was entitled to my home, my space, my hard-earned property. He wasn't leaving willingly, and arguing with him wasn't going to change that. So I did something that surprised even myself. I went quiet. I didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't give him the satisfaction of a dramatic fight. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, cold and absolute. When I finally spoke again, my voice was devoid of any emotion. "Enjoy it while it lasts." I hung up before he could respond, because if Mark thought he could just take what was mine without consequence, he had no idea what was coming. I didn't call Mark back, didn't text him, didn't acknowledge what he had done, because I knew exactly how his mind worked and how he thrived on confrontation. He expected me to rage, to threaten, to engage in the same exhausting back and forth that he had relied on for years to wear people down until they finally gave in just to shut him up. He was waiting for me to snap, to call our mother, to stomp my feet and tell him exactly what he wanted to hear, that I would let it go, that I would let them stay, that I would play the role of the accommodating sister like I always had. But I did none of those things. Instead, I let the silence stretch, let him sit in his false sense of victory, let him believe that he had won. Days passed without a word from me, and I knew my lack of reaction was making him bolder, more confident in the idea that he had successfully taken what he wanted. I started hearing from extended family. Subtle little comments slipped into conversations that made it clear he had been talking. My aunt called me to ask how my work was going, casually mentioning how nice it must feel to do something good for my brother and his family. A cousin sent me a message on social media saying it was great that Mark finally got the vacation he deserved after working so hard all year. He was spinning his own narrative, rewriting the story into something that fit his version of reality, and I knew exactly how it would play out. By the end of the week, my mother finally called, her voice warm at first, but carrying that carefully placed tone of concern that I had heard 1,000 times before. "Sweetheart," she said, drawing out the word in that way that always meant she was about to ask me for something I didn't want to give. "I talked to Mark yesterday, and he told me that you're letting them stay at your vacation house for a little while. That's so wonderful of you, honey, really. I know it must not have been easy, but it's good to see family looking out for each other." I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my lips together as I steadied my breath, picturing the smug grin Mark probably had on his face while feeding her that lie. "Is that what he told you?" I asked, keeping my voice even, though I could feel the slow burn of anger simmering beneath my ribs. My mother sighed, and I could practically hear her shifting in her chair, preparing to launch into a lecture about generosity and kindness. "I know you two don't always see eye to eye, and I know Mark can be a little impulsive sometimes, but honey, they have kids. They needed a place to go for the summer, and you have that big house just sitting there empty. Would it really hurt you to let them stay a little while longer?" I tilted my head back against the couch, staring at the ceiling, biting back the immediate response that wanted to spill out, the one that would remind her that Mark wasn't some struggling man with no options, that he had a job, that he had money, that he had every ability to afford his own place, but simply chose to take what wasn't his because it was easier. Instead, I smiled, even though she couldn't see it, and kept my voice light and sweet, dripping with the same kind of performative warmth she was giving me. "Sure, Mom. I'll take care of it." There was a brief pause, likely because she hadn't expected me to agree so quickly, but she recovered quickly enough, her voice brightening. "Oh, sweetheart, I knew you would. You always do the right thing." I murmured something in response, something non-committal that didn't actually mean anything, before I ended the call and placed my phone on the table beside me. Then, without hesitating, I reached for my laptop, opened my email, and pulled up the contact information for the real estate agent I had worked with when I originally bought the house. I hadn't spoken to him in a while, but I knew he would take my call the moment he saw my name on the screen. When he answered, his voice was cheerful, professional, always eager to do business. "Hey, it's been a while. What can I do for you?" I didn't hesitate, didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't waste a single second pretending this was anything other than what it was. "I want to sell the vacation home," I said plainly, keeping my voice steady and sure, because there was no hesitation left in me now. And I want it sold fast. There was a beat of silence on the other end, then a soft chuckle as he recovered from my abruptness. "Well, that's certainly a surprise, but I can absolutely make that happen. Are you looking for a private sale, or do you want it listed publicly?" "Public," I answered immediately, already envisioning the listing going live, already picturing the look on Mark's face when he realized what was happening. "I want as many offers as possible, and I want it closed as soon as legally possible." He let out a low whistle, clearly amused by my urgency, but he didn't question it. "All right, I'll pull the market data, put together the listing, and we'll get things moving. Should I send everything to your email?" "Do that," I confirmed, my fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of my couch, my mind already running through the logistics, the planning, the way I would ensure that everything lined up perfectly for maximum effect. "And let's make sure we close before summer ends." "You got it," he said easily, the confidence in his voice reassuring me that this was the right move, the only move. After I ended the call, I leaned back, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of my decision settle into place. Mark thought he had won. He thought my silence meant surrender, thought my lack of reaction was proof that he had finally worn me down. What he didn't know was that I wasn't the type to fight battles with yelling or empty threats. No, I fought with action, with strategy, with patience. And soon, very soon, he would learn exactly what that meant. The morning after I spoke to my real estate agent, I woke up earlier than usual, my mind sharp and focused on the plan that had fully formed overnight. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, no nagging voice in the back of my head telling me to reconsider what I was about to do. Mark had made his choice when he moved into my house without permission, and now I was making mine. I logged into my email, saw the listing details my agent had sent over, and reviewed them with a keen eye, ensuring that everything was in place to attract buyers quickly. The house was in a prime location, a perfect getaway spot, well-maintained and furnished beautifully, which meant it would sell fast, exactly what I needed. I responded with my approval, gave the green light for it to be officially listed, and then sat back in my chair, waiting for the inevitable domino effect that was about to unfold. I didn't tell anyone, didn't make a single mention of what I was doing, didn't drop even the smallest hint that my vacation home would soon belong to someone else. Mark was still comfortably settled in, still basking in his undeserved victory, still telling anyone who would listen that I'd come around and accepted the situation. He had always been someone who mistook silence for weakness, someone who believed that if people didn't push back immediately, it meant they had given up. He had no idea that I was the kind of person who believed in patience, in long-term consequences, in making sure that when the hit finally came, it came hard. The listing went live that afternoon, and within 24 hours, my agent had already received multiple inquiries from interested buyers. By the end of the second day, there were offers coming in, all of them competitive, all of them proving what I already knew, that this house was valuable, desirable, and in demand. Meanwhile, as I carefully reviewed the offers being submitted, Mark was busy posting pictures online, sharing snapshots of his perfect little summer retreat, smiling with his wife on the back deck, grilling burgers in my outdoor kitchen, sipping drinks by my pool. His captions made it sound like the house belonged to him, like this was some well-earned break he was taking after working so hard, like He wasn't living there as an uninvited guest who had crossed every possible boundary. He was bragging, flaunting, making sure the world knew just how much he was enjoying the generosity he believed I had shown him. I scrolled through his posts, reading comments from mutual friends and extended family, most of them praising him for finally getting to relax, for treating his wife and kids to a beautiful vacation, for having such a kind and supportive sister who had let him stay in such an incredible place. I saw people commenting about how lucky he was, how great it must feel to have a sibling who cared about him enough to give him such an amazing opportunity, how wonderful it was that I had softened up and allowed my family to share in my success. I didn't respond to any of them, didn't correct their assumptions, didn't waste my energy trying to fight against the image Mark had so carefully constructed. Instead, I focused on my goal, on the bigger picture, on the knowledge that soon enough, he would be in for the shock of his life. By the end of the week, I had chosen the strongest offer and set a closing date, one that worked perfectly for my timeline, one that ensured that the moment Mark thought he had truly settled in, he would be uprooted in the most brutal way possible. My agent called me with excitement in his voice, letting me know that everything was moving quickly, that the buyers were eager, that we were on track to have the deal finalized without any delays. I thanked him, told him I trusted him to handle the details, and then sat back in my chair, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of control over the situation. A few days later, I heard through the family grapevine that Mark and his wife were planning to take a weekend trip in early August, heading to a nearby city for some kind of music festival, leaving the house empty for a couple of nights. I didn't react, didn't comment, didn't let on that this was the exact window I had been hoping for, the perfect opportunity to execute the final stage of my plan. The closing date was set for that same weekend, ensuring that by the time Mark returned, the house would no longer be mine, the locks would be changed, and his so-called vacation home would belong to someone else. I imagined his face when he pulled into the driveway and saw unfamiliar cars parked outside, when he walked up to the door and found that his key no longer worked, when he knocked and was met by strangers who would look at him with confusion, wondering why some random man was trying to enter their newly purchased home. I imagined the way his smug confidence would evaporate, the way the reality of the situation would finally crash down on him, the way he would scramble to call me, demanding answers, only to be met with the cold, undeniable truth that he had brought this on himself. I had no doubt that he would be furious, that he would lash out, that he would throw every insult and accusation my way, but none of it would matter. By then, it would be too late for him to do anything about it. The house would be gone, the deal would be done, and all the entitlement in the world wouldn't change the fact that he had been outplayed. Mark thought he had won, thought he had pulled one over on me, thought he had gotten exactly what he wanted without consequences. He had no idea what was coming. The morning of closing day arrived with an eerie sense of calm, the kind that comes just before a storm, the kind that makes you aware that something big is about to happen but keeps you suspended in the silence before the impact. I woke up early, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone, knowing that within a matter of hours, everything would shift, and Mark would finally come to understand just how badly he had miscalculated. There was no turning back now, no chance for him to argue his way out of this, no last-minute pleas that could undo the wheels that had been set in motion weeks ago. Today, the house would officially belong to someone else, and Mark, still blissfully unaware, would soon find himself homeless in the most brutal and unexpected way possible. I arrived at the house just after noon, pulling into the driveway for what would be the last time as the rightful owner, stepping out of my car with a strange mix of nostalgia and satisfaction settling in my chest. This house had been a personal milestone for me, a symbol of my hard work, my independence, my ability to build something of value without anyone's help. And yet, over the last several weeks, it had become something else entirely, a battleground, a reminder that no matter how much success I achieved, there would always be people who felt entitled to take what wasn't theirs, people like Mark who saw my accomplishments not as something to admire, but as something to exploit. But today, that would all end. The new owners arrived right on schedule, a couple in their early 40s who had been eager to close the deal, their excitement radiating from them as they stepped out of their car, their eyes lighting up as they took in their new home. I could see the anticipation in their expressions, the way they looked at the house like it was a dream finally realized, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction knowing that it was going to people who genuinely valued it. Unlike Mark, they had worked for this, had earned it, had respected the process enough to do things the right way rather than assuming they could just take whatever they wanted without consequence. We exchanged pleasantries as I handed over the keys, making small talk about the neighborhood, about the best local spots to eat, about the little quirks of the house that they might want to be aware of. It was a simple, smooth transition, the kind that should have been completely unremarkable, except for the fact that I knew something they didn't, that within the next 24 hours, they would likely find themselves face to face with a very confused and very angry man who would insist that he had some kind of claim to the house they had just legally purchased. Before I left, I decided to give them a final piece of advice, one that I knew they would thank me for later. I turned to the husband, keeping my voice casual, my expression neutral, as I said, "Oh, and if you see someone trying to get in, someone who looks like they think they belong here, don't hesitate to call the cops. He's not supposed to be here, and he's not going to take it well when he realizes the house isn't his." The husband frowned slightly, glancing toward his wife before looking back at me, clearly trying to gauge how serious I was being. "Someone trying to get in?" he repeated, his tone cautious, as if he wasn't sure whether I was warning him about a potential break-in or just giving him a heads-up about an annoying neighbor. I gave a small, knowing smile, tilting my head slightly as I tucked my hands into my pockets. Let's just say the previous unofficial occupant has no idea the house has been sold, and he's not exactly the reasonable type. I doubt he'll cause any real trouble, but if he does show up acting like he owns the place, don't engage. Just call the authorities and let them handle it. The wife let out a short laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "Are you serious? Someone's been living here and doesn't know the house has been sold." I nodded, my expression never wavering, because there was nothing about this situation that I found funny. Completely serious. He was never supposed to be here in the first place, but he decided to help himself. He'll figure it out soon enough. The husband exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair before nodding. "All right, we'll keep an eye out. Thanks for the warning." I gave them both a final nod before stepping back toward my car, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me as I slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. I had done what needed to be done, had handled the situation in the best possible way, had given Mark every opportunity to do the right thing before taking matters into my own hands. And now, there was nothing left for me to do but wait, to let the inevitable chaos unfold exactly as I had planned. As I drove away, I didn't bother looking in the rearview mirror, didn't let myself linger on what had been, didn't waste a single second wondering whether or not this was the right decision. Because the truth was, Mark had made this choice for himself the moment he stepped into my house without permission, the moment he assumed that I would just roll over and accept his blatant disrespect. He had convinced himself that he had won, that his manipulation had worked, that I had given up and given in. But Mark had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that by the time he returned from his little weekend getaway, the locks would be changed, the house would belong to someone else, and he would be left standing on the front porch of a place he once thought was his, completely and utterly powerless. And for the first time in my life, I was looking forward to the moment he realized exactly how wrong he had been. Mark's weekend trip had been something he had planned for weeks, something he had casually boasted about to friends and family, something that further cemented his belief that he had secured a long-term stay in my vacation home without consequence. He and Amanda had driven out of town early Friday morning, their car packed with overnight bags, their kids excitedly chattering about the festival they were attending, oblivious to the fact that by the time they returned, the home they had so brazenly claimed as their own would no longer be theirs to return to. I knew exactly when they would be back, had anticipated the moment down to the very hour, had prepared myself for the inevitable fallout that was about to unfold, had waited with patience as the final piece of my plan clicked perfectly into place. It was early Sunday evening when Mark's car finally pulled into the driveway, the familiar sound of his tires crunching over the gravel marking the beginning of what I knew would be one of the most satisfying moments of my life. He stepped out of the driver's seat, stretching lazily, completely unaware that the world he had so confidently built for himself was about to come crashing down in a way he never saw coming. Amanda was the first to notice that something was off, her head tilting slightly as she stared toward the front porch, her eyes narrowing at the sight of a moving truck parked just a few feet away. Mark followed her gaze, his expression shifting from relaxed to puzzled as he watched two men carry a heavy piece of furniture through the open front door, their movements efficient, their purpose clear. There were boxes stacked on the walkway, a large mirror leaned carefully against the side of the house, a collection of household items waiting to be placed inside, all of it belonging to people he had never met, people who were now claiming the space he had once foolishly assumed was his. For the first time in weeks, the arrogance disappeared from his face, replaced instead by pure, unfiltered confusion, a slow realization creeping through him as his brain struggled to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. Without speaking, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the key he had used so carelessly, so confidently, so often in the past. He stepped forward, ignoring Amanda's hesitant voice behind him, ignoring the way his kids had fallen silent, ignoring the sinking feeling that had begun to settle in his chest. He placed the key into the lock, twisted, and felt nothing but resistance. He tried again, his movements growing more forceful, more frantic, more desperate, but the result remained the same. The door would not budge. The lock had been changed. The house was no longer his to enter. Amanda stepped closer, her voice now sharper, more urgent, carrying the first hints of panic as she looked between him and the unfamiliar furniture being carried inside. "Mark, what's going on?" she asked, her hand gripping his arm, her eyes darting toward the open garage, which was now occupied by a car they had never seen before. "Why won't the key work?" Mark didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he truly didn't know. He couldn't process it, couldn't wrap his mind around the reality that was unfolding in front of him, couldn't accept the possibility that something had happened while he was away, something that he had never even considered a possibility. His grip tightened around the key, his jaw clenched, his body tensed as the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. And then, as if the universe itself had chosen that exact moment to hammer the final nail into his delusion, the door opened from the inside, revealing a man in his 40s, dressed casually, his expression one of mild curiosity rather than concern. He looked at Mark, at Amanda, at the children standing awkwardly behind them, his eyes flickering briefly to the keys still clutched in Mark's hand before offering a polite but firm smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice even, his demeanor relaxed, completely unaware that the man standing on his porch was moments away from coming undone. Mark blinked, his mouth opening and closing as his brain fought to find words, to construct a sentence, to grasp onto anything that might explain why there was a stranger standing in what should have been his doorway, speaking to him as if he were the intruder, as if he were the one who didn't belong. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing shallow, his face growing hot with confusion and frustration, his mind refusing to accept what his senses were screaming at him. Mark started, his voice cracking slightly before he swallowed and tried again, his frustration bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "What are you doing here?" "This is my house." The man's polite smile didn't waver, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight tightening of his shoulders, a flicker of amusement in his eyes as he glanced back into the house, taking in the boxes and furniture, the unmistakable signs of new ownership. "I think you might be mistaken," he replied, his voice calm, his words slow and deliberate. "This house was just sold. My wife and I closed on it 2 days ago." The color drained from Mark's face instantly, his entire body going rigid as the final, undeniable truth crashed into him with full force. He took a half-step backward, shaking his head, his eyes darting from the man to the moving truck to the open garage to the unfamiliar car parked in what used to be his driveway. His lips parted, a disjointed sound escaping him, something between disbelief and protest, something that held no real weight because deep down, he already knew there was no coming back from this. Amanda's breath hitched beside him, her hand tightening around his arm as her own realization settled in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, what did you do?" Mark didn't answer her. He couldn't. Instead, with trembling fingers, he pulled out his phone, his movements slow, mechanical, unsteady. He scrolled through his contacts, found my name, and pressed the call button, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack under the pressure. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, the sound echoing loudly in his ears, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like an unbearable force. And then, just as the call was about to go to voicemail, just when he thought I might actually pick up and give him the explanation he so desperately craved, I let it ring. And ring. And ring. Because Mark had spent his entire life ignoring consequences, but today, for the first time, he would be forced to sit with them in silence. The phone kept ringing, vibrating on the table beside me as I sat in my quiet apartment, sipping my morning coffee and scrolling absent-mindedly through my emails. Mark had tried calling me twice the night before, but I had ignored him, letting him stew in the confusion, the frustration, the dawning realization that he had finally, undeniably, lost. But now, as the sun rose and my phone lit up with his name for the 3rd time in less than 5 minutes, I decided it was time to let him say his piece. I wasn't expecting calm, wasn't expecting reason, wasn't expecting anything other than the entitled, furious meltdown that I knew was coming the second he opened his mouth. I picked up the call without saying a word, letting the silence stretch between us, waiting for him to make the first move, waiting for the explosion I knew was brewing on the other end of the line. And then, like a thunderclap, it came. "Are you fucking kidding me?" Mark's voice was raw with rage, the sheer force of his anger so intense that I had to pull the phone slightly away from my ear. "Where's my stuff? Where the hell are we supposed to go? What the fuck did you do?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through me, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle deep in my chest as I listened to him unravel, as I listened to him grasp desperately for control over a situation that had already slipped completely through his fingers. "Not my problem, Mark," I said simply, my voice calm, steady, utterly devoid of the reaction he so clearly wanted from me. He went silent for a second, and I could almost picture the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands probably curled into fists, the way he was struggling to comprehend the fact that this was actually happening. And then, as expected, the explosion continued. "Not your problem? Not your problem?" he repeated, his voice rising in pitch, filled with disbelief, filled with fury. "You sold the house, you sold my home, and you think you can just brush it off like it's nothing?" I let out a small chuckle, shaking my head as I leaned back against my chair, tapping my fingers lightly against the side of my mug. "It was never your home, Mark," I said, my tone carrying just the slightest edge of amusement, just enough to let him know that I was enjoying this moment far more than I should. "It was my house, and you were a guest, except, no, wait, that's not even right because a guest is invited and you just helped yourself like you always do." The sound he made was somewhere between a scoff and a growl, something that told me he was barely keeping himself together, something that told me he was used to getting his way, used to people caving under the weight of his temper, used to bending situations to his will. "This is insane," he spat, his breath heavy, his frustration so palpable I could practically feel it through the phone. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any idea how this affects my family? We have nowhere to go, we have nothing, and it's all because of you." I rolled my eyes, barely suppressing a laugh as I set my coffee down and rested my elbow on the table, shaking my head at his sheer, unbelievable audacity. "You have nowhere to go because you never bothered finding somewhere to go," I pointed out, my voice laced with something dangerously close to boredom. "You had months to figure something out, but instead, you decided to squat in my house and pretend like that was a long-term solution. Now you're dealing with the consequences of your choices, Mark. Not mine." His breathing grew louder, more erratic, like he was pacing, like he was running his hands through his hair, like he was barely keeping himself from throwing his phone across whatever hotel room or parking lot he was currently standing in. "You could have just let us stay," he said, his voice dropping slightly, taking on that familiar, insidious tone he always used when he was trying to manipulate, trying to guilt, trying to twist reality to fit his needs. "You could have helped your family, but instead you—" I cut him off before he could even finish, my patience wearing dangerously thin, my amusement now shifting into something sharper, something colder, something that had been buried under years of his bullshit and was finally surfacing. "You don't get to play the victim here, Mark," I snapped, my voice no longer bored, no longer entertained, but firm, final, leaving no room for argument. "You stole from me. You took what wasn't yours, you ignored me when I told you no, you moved into my home like you were entitled to it, and now you're pissed because I made sure you couldn't keep something you had no right to in the first place. That's not my fault. That's not my problem. That's yours." He was silent again, but this time, the anger was different. It wasn't explosive anymore, wasn't fiery and raw and full of immediate, thoughtless rage. No, this was something else, something slower, something deeper, something that told me he was realizing that no matter what he said, no matter what buttons he tried to push, no matter what pathetic excuse or guilt trip he attempted, he had lost. And then, after what felt like a full minute of tense silence, he finally spoke again, his voice lower now, dripping with venom, with resentment, with the kind of bitterness that I knew would linger long after this conversation ended. "You're gonna regret this," he said, his words slow, measured, carrying the weight of a threat he had no real power to enforce. "You think you're so fucking smart, but you don't even realize what you've done. You don't screw over family like this and just walk away." I exhaled softly, letting his words sit between us for a moment before responding, my voice lighter, almost amused again, almost taunting. "Family helps family, right?" I asked, echoing the words he had thrown at me so many times before, the words he had weaponized to justify every selfish thing he had ever done. "Hope someone helps you." And with that, before he could say another word, before he could spew another empty threat or try one last pathetic attempt at getting under my skin, I ended the call. I blocked his number. And I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I knew, without a doubt, that Mark was finally out of mine. It didn't take long for the rest of the family to find out what had happened, because Mark, being who he was, made sure that everyone heard his version of the story first, the one where he was the victim, the one where I was the cold-hearted villain who had cruelly and unnecessarily ripped his home away from him. He painted the picture exactly how I knew he would, carefully omitting all the parts where he had ignored my boundaries, where he had taken advantage of me, where he had assumed he could get away with stealing what wasn't his. Instead, he turned it into a sob story about how he had simply been trying to take care of his family, how he had been blindsided by his heartless sister, how he had come home expecting to rest in his house only to find that it had been ripped out from under him without warning. The phone calls started within hours of my final conversation with him, my name suddenly the topic of whispered conversations, of heated family debates, of furious accusations, and reluctant agreements. Some sided with me immediately, recognizing that Mark had pushed too far, understanding that he had gotten exactly what he deserved, acknowledging that if he had just respected my decision in the first place, none of this would have happened. Others, however, took his side without question, because family loyalty had always been a one-way street in their eyes, because I was expected to forgive, to accommodate, to sacrifice, because they believed that no matter what, blood was supposed to come first. My mother was the first to call, her voice tight with barely restrained frustration, the kind she only ever used when she was trying to keep herself from outright yelling. "Sweetheart, I just got off the phone with your brother, and he's devastated," she said, her words clipped, controlled, chosen carefully to make me feel guilty. "I don't know what you were thinking, but you need to fix this." I let out a slow breath, rubbing my temple as I braced myself for what I knew was about to be a long, exhausting conversation. "There's nothing to fix, Mom," I said flatly, my patience already running thin. "The house wasn't his, it was mine, and he stole it. I told him no, and he did it anyway. He's not the victim here, no matter how much he wants you to think he is." She scoffed, the sound sharp and disbelieving, as if the very idea of me refusing to help my brother was something so unfathomable that it barely made sense to her. "Oh, come on," she snapped, her voice laced with irritation. "You could have just let them stay a little longer. He has kids, for God's sake. What were they supposed to do? Sleep on the streets? Do you even care what happens to them?" I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself not to let her get under my skin, forcing myself to remember that this was exactly how things had always been. Mark making a mess, Mark expecting someone else to clean it up, Mark getting away with everything because everyone was too afraid to hold him accountable. "He's a grown man, Mom," I said, my tone colder now, sharper, no longer willing to entertain the endless cycle of enabling that had been going on for years. He had months to figure something out, and instead, he spent that time playing house in my home, bragging about it like he'd won some prize, posting pictures and acting like he owned the place. He had every opportunity to find a solution, but he didn't, because he thought he didn't have to. And now, for the first time in his life, he's facing the consequences of his own actions. That's his problem, not mine. The silence that followed was thick with tension, filled with the unspoken understanding that I was no longer playing the role they had assigned to me, no longer bending, no longer folding under the weight of their expectations. Finally, my mother let out a slow, frustrated sigh, the exhaustion evident in her voice. "I just don't understand why you have to be so cold about this," she muttered, her tone quieter now, almost resigned. "He's your brother. Family is supposed to help family." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only bitterness, only exhaustion, only the deep, unwavering certainty that I was done. "Yeah? Well, funny thing about that, Mom, family is also supposed to respect each other. Family is supposed to listen when you say no. Family isn't supposed to steal from you, isn't supposed to ignore your boundaries, isn't supposed to treat you like their personal safety net while giving nothing in return. So, if you want to talk about what family is supposed to do, maybe you should start with him." Another silence, another sigh, another moment where I could feel the weight of her disappointment pressing against me like an anchor. But I didn't care. Not anymore. Meanwhile, Mark was bouncing from couch to couch, staying with whatever friend or relative was still willing to put up with him, spinning his story in whatever way he needed to in order to keep himself from accepting that he had done this to himself. I knew he wasn't struggling financially, knew he had more than enough money to get a short-term rental, knew that he could have easily found a place to stay if he actually tried. But that was the thing about Mark, he didn't want to try. He wanted things to be handed to him, wanted the easy way out, wanted someone else to clean up the mess he had made, and when no one did, he wanted to play the victim. I didn't care. I didn't care that he was pissed off. I didn't care that he was couch surfing. I didn't care that half the family was mad at me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying it anymore, wasn't letting his problems become my problems, wasn't letting the weight of his poor decisions rest on my shoulders. That night, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine in one hand and my phone in the other, a new message popped up on my screen, the name Mark glaring back at me, the words beneath it short, clipped, laced with venom. "You'll regret this." I stared at the message for a long moment, my lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, something that carried no fear, no hesitation, no doubt. And then, without a second thought, I blocked his number. Because if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was that the only person living with regret now was him. A month had passed since I sold the house, a month of silence, a month of peace, a month without the constant buzzing of my phone filled with accusations, threats, and demands from people who thought they had any right to tell me what I should or shouldn't have done. The dust had settled, the storm had passed, and I had finally begun to enjoy the weightlessness that came with knowing I no longer owed anyone a single thing. No more arguments, no more guilt trips, no more feeling like I had to justify why I had made a decision to protect myself from someone who had never once considered how his actions affected me. I hadn't driven past the house since the day I handed over the keys, hadn't felt the need to check in on it, hadn't even thought about it much beyond the occasional satisfaction of knowing that Mark was still reeling from the consequences of his own choices. But that morning, as I sat in my car parked just down the street, looking at the house that used to be mine, I realized that it no longer felt like a place I had any attachment to. It was different now, with new curtains in the windows, a different car in the driveway, the porch decorated with plants that hadn't been there when I owned it. The people who lived there now had already made it theirs, already settled in, already erased any traces of the life Mark had tried to claim for himself. And standing there, looking at what had once been my own personal retreat, I felt absolutely nothing resembling regret. Mark, on the other hand, was still very much homeless in every way that mattered, still bouncing between friends' couches, still refusing to take responsibility, still clinging to the story that I had done something to him rather than accepting that he had done it to himself. The family had stopped pressing me about it, realizing that no amount of guilt-tripping would change my mind, but that didn't mean they had stopped talking. I knew there were whispers, knew there were some who thought I had gone too far, knew there were people who believed I should have let it go, let him win, let him take what he wanted just to keep the peace. But peace had never been an option as long as Mark believed he could get away with whatever he wanted, and for the first time in my life, I had finally proven to him that he couldn't. Our last conversation had been short, clipped, filled with the kind of disbelief that only comes when someone finally realizes that the rules they've been bending their entire life have finally broken beneath them. "I can't believe you did this," he had said, his voice hoarse, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, shock, maybe even the first hints of real fear that for the first time, there was no way out of the mess he had made. "I can," I had responded, my voice steady, my words final, leaving no room for debate, no opening for him to try and twist reality into something that benefited him. And that had been it. No screaming, no pleading, no last-ditch efforts to convince me that I was wrong. Just silence. I had waited my entire life for Mark to learn a lesson that had been coming to him for years, and now, standing there looking at the house that no longer belonged to either of us, I knew that whether he wanted to admit it or not, he had finally learned it. Some lessons come easy. Some lessons come soft. Some lessons come with a gentle warning, a helping hand, a second chance. But some lessons come hard. And for the first time in his life, Mark had just learned his. I pulled out my phone one last time, scrolling through my messages, seeing the unread texts still sitting there from days ago, the final attempts, the last desperate grasps for control that he had once wielded so effortlessly. "You'll regret this. You think you won? You think this is over? You're heartless. You're selfish. You'll be alone one day, and no one will help you." I hovered my finger over his name. Let myself take one last look at the messages. Let myself savor the knowledge that no matter how many times he tried to convince himself that he had the upper hand, he knew the truth now. And then, without another thought, without hesitation, without a single ounce of remorse, I did the one thing I should have done a long time ago. I blocked his number. For the first time in my life, Mark was no longer my problem. And I had never felt so free. Was I too ruthless? Or was this the only way to teach him a lesson? Let me know in the comments.